Somewhere below the ice of a moon with no name that any human had ever spoken aloud, something opened a door in a mind that did not want to be opened. The choir did not knock. The choir had never needed to. It reached into the woman's skull the way water finds a crack, patient and total, and it expected to find what it always found in a single, solitary creature. A short corridor. A few rooms. Something small enough to read in an afternoon and forget by evening. It found something else instead. Mara Okoye was strapped into a resin chair in a room with no true walls, only a soft curved membrane the color of old bone, breathing slow, and even because the medics of the station had learned that her heart rate spiked when she was frightened, and a frightened human was a noisy one, and noise made the reading harder. She had been awake for 11 hours since the shuttle went dark around her. She had counted them by the pulse of a small light above the door that blinked once every 4 minutes for reasons she had never been told. She did not know the thing settling into the back of her mind had a name. She only knew the pressure of it, the way you know a hand on your shoulder before you turn to look at whose hand it is. Voice 4412 of the choir of the Hollow Moon did not think of itself as an individual, because the choir did not raise individuals. It raised threads. Somewhere in the vast fungal lattice threaded through the rock beneath the station, 10,000 other threads were doing 10,000 other useful things at that exact moment. One was regulating the humidity in a spore nursery 3 levels down. One was negotiating, in the slow patient language the choir used for such things, the correct ratio of minerals to feed a new growth chamber. One was simply resting, the way a muscle rests between uses, waiting to be called on again. None of them were thinking about themselves, because none of them had a self large enough to think about. This thread's task, assigned an hour earlier in a burst of shared intention that felt to it the way a decision feels to a human hand before the hand knows it is reaching, was simple. Link with the captured pilot. Read what she carried. Report anything of tactical use regarding the human resistance fleet massing 3 systems away. Then let the reading dissolve back into the choir, the way all readings dissolved, the way all pain dissolved, the way everything that was not useful eventually dissolved. It had done this 100 times with other species along the long slow border where the choir's territory met the strange, noisy, inefficient life of the wider galaxy. Small burrowing things with simple nervous systems. Colony insects whose minds were already halfway to a collective the moment you touched them, eager almost, grateful to be absorbed into something larger and steadier than themselves. It expected to do this once more, quickly, cleanly, and move on to the next assignment waiting in the queue. It slid deeper into Mara Okoye's mind, tasting for the shape of her thoughts the way its kind tasted spores on a current of air, and the first thing it found was not fear. It was arithmetic. She was counting the shuttle's cargo manifest backward from memory, a nervous habit that kept the coordinates of the resistance fleet's staging ground buried under 17 minutes of grain totals and fuel ratios, a small deliberate wall built out of boredom and discipline. 640 kilograms of preserved protein. 11,000 liters of reactor coolant. The voice noted this with a flicker of something like approval. Clever. Fragile creatures were often clever, the way a moth was clever at finding light before it burned in it. It would not take long to get past. It reached further, past the numbers, into the warm, dark, cluttered space beneath them, and touched something that made it recoil for the first time in 400 cycles of its existence. It was not a wall. It was not a lie. It was grief, and it was old, and it had not dissolved. The breach. Before it could make sense of the grief, it needed to understand where the grief had come from, and so it drifted backward through Mara's memory to the freshest wound it could find, the one still raw enough to bleed at the edges, 3 days ago, when the boarding party had come through the shuttle's outer hatch. The memory arrived not in the tidy, filed order of older grief, but jagged, out of sequence, the way fresh trauma always sat before the mind had time to build proper shelving for it. Velsa experienced it almost as if it were happening to itself, a disorienting side effect of touching something so recently made. There had been an alarm, a thin electronic shriek that meant the hull had been breached somewhere aft. There had been Resen Alvi, second pilot, 26 years old, sprinting past Mara toward the aft bulkhead with a fire suppression rod that was never meant to be a weapon, because it was the only thing within reach. There had been a sound Velsa did not have context for at first and then understood, from the shape of Mara's memory around it, was the sound a person makes exactly once, when something goes through them that was never meant to. Mara had not seen the boarding party's actual attack. She had been forward, at the helm, trying uselessly to bring engines back online that had been cold for 6 hours specifically so the shuttle would not be found. She had heard Ressen's voice cut off mid-shout. She had turned in time to see 3 of the choir's containment threads, grown into hard-jointed bodies for exactly this purpose, folding what remained of her crewmate into the floor of the corridor with the calm, unhurried efficiency of something performing routine maintenance. She had not been able to save him. She had not even had time to be afraid for him before it was already finished. What she carried instead, filed with brutal precision into the same architecture that held her brother's death, was a very specific, very small detail that Velser found she had kept sharper than almost anything else in the entire memory. The fact that Ressen's last word, cut short before the breach reached him, had been her name. He had been trying to warn her. Velser traced backward through the days before the boarding, curious now about the shape of the man behind the single cut-off syllable of her name, and found a quieter portrait than the panic of his death suggested. Resen Alvi had been, by every measure Mara's memory offered, an unremarkable pilot, competent without being gifted, prone to humming tunelessly while running pre-flight checks in a way that had irritated Mara for the first 6 months of their posting together and become, somewhere in the 18 months since, a small comfort she had not noticed she relied on until it stopped. He had joined the resistance not out of any burning conviction, Velser found, but because the alternative, staying behind on a colony the choir's listening stations had already begun quietly mapping, had felt to him like waiting patiently to be found. He had told Mara once, on a long quiet watch shift 8 months earlier, that he did not expect to survive the war, and had said it not with despair but with a kind of practical resignation, the same tone a person might use describing bad weather they had decided to travel through anyway. Mara had told him to stop talking like that. He had laughed, apologized, and kept humming. Velser found this portrait harder to set down than almost anything else it had touched so far, not because the grief attached to it was sharper than her brother's, but because it was so ordinary, built from 18 months of small unremarkable proximity rather than any single dramatic bond, and ordinary, he was beginning to understand, did not make a loss lighter to a species like this one. It only meant the loss was woven through more of the everyday fabric a person actually lived in, which made it, if anything, harder to root around. Velser sat with this fragment longer than it meant to. It understood, distantly, that this was precisely the kind of detail the choir would have wanted it to note and forward upward, evidence of the boarding action's efficiency, confirmation that resistance had been minimal and swiftly ended. It found, instead, that it did not want to report the detail at all. It wanted, for reasons it could not yet name, to simply let it sit, the way Mara had let it sit, unspoken and unresolved, a debt she had not yet found any way to repay. It lingered a moment longer in the fragments surrounding the boarding, the way one circles back to check a wound that has already been dressed, simply to be certain it was dressed correctly. It found, tucked just behind the shock of the memory, the specific, small, human absurdity of what Mara had done in the seconds immediately after. She had not screamed, had not frozen, had instead reached for the nearest console and begun, with hands that betrayed no visible tremor at all, to purge the shuttle's navigation logs one folder at a time, methodically, because some cold practical part of her mind had already decided that whatever grief was coming for her later, it would not be allowed to arrive before the job was finished. Velser found this sequencing strange almost past understanding. In the choir, a threat this immediate would have triggered an instant, total, undifferentiated response, every relevant thread flooding the same problem at once until it was solved or the affected thread was lost. There was no precedent anywhere in its 400 cycles for a mind that could feel the full weight of a fresh, catastrophic loss and continue, in the very same breath, to execute a checklist. It found, too, the particular quality of the silence that had followed, once the logs were purged and there was, finally, nothing productive left to do. Mara had sat alone in the cockpit for 11 minutes by the shuttle's own chronometer, hands still on the console, before she allowed herself to cry, and even then she had done it quietly, almost apologetically, as though grief itself were a resource to be rationed rather than a flood to be endured all at once. Velser understood, distantly and for the first time, that this was not coldness. It was triage. The human mind, faced with more pain than it could safely process at once, did not shut the pain out the way the choir diffused an unwanted signal. It simply filed the pain for later, the way it filed everything else, and kept working until later arrived. It withdrew from the memory of the boarding slowly, the way one steps back from the edge of something taller than expected, and carried the weight of Resen Alvi's cut-off warning forward with it into everything that came after, without quite understanding why it felt heavier than the tactical value of the memory could account for. What the fleet wanted to know. The station's command chamber was not a room so much as a held breath, a hollow at the center of the moon lined with threads that pulsed faintly gold when the choir spoke among itself. There, An elder integration called Kest Ren maintained the discipline of the whole colony the way a gardener maintains the shape of a hedge, trimming away anything that grew wrong before it could spread. Kest Ren had ordered the capture of the human shuttle 3 days earlier, when it strayed too close to the relay station while running dark, engines cold, drifting on momentum alone toward what the choir's long-range listening threads believed was a supply route feeding the human resistance. The shuttle carried 2 crew. One had died in the boarding action, its body already folded gently into the mycelial floor to be broken down into something useful, the way the choir broke down everything eventually, matter and mind alike. The other, the pilot and translator, had been kept. Extract what she knows of the fleet's staging locations and defenses. The order had gone out, threaded through 10,000 minds at once, arriving in each of them not as words but as a single unmistakable pressure, the way a scent arrives before a thought about the scent does. Then let her dissolve into containment. She is one growth. She will not be missed by history. This was not cruelty, as the choir understood cruelty. The choir did not believe in cruelty any more than a river believes in cruelty when it wears down a stone over 10,000 years without ever once intending harm. Individual suffering was, to the choir, simply inefficient. A single mind held pain the way a single leaf held rain, briefly, before the rain ran off and joined the larger water table beneath it. The choir's own pain, whenever a thread was lost or a harvest failed or a growth chamber collapsed under its own weight, was instantly diffused across 10,000 others, diluted until it registered as nothing sharper than a faint chemical sourness in the collective air, gone within a season. This was, the choir believed, the mark of a superior design. No single voice could be broken, because no single voice carried enough weight on its own to break. Vel Sir, though it did not yet think of the number 4412 as a name, only as an address, the way a room in a building has a number but no name until someone lives there long enough to give it one, had absorbed this belief the way a fish absorbs water, without ever noticing it was swimming in anything at all. It had watched, over its 400 cycles, dozens of extractions like this one. It had watched other species come apart cleanly under the choir's patient reading, their grief and fear and memory sorted, useful pieces kept, the rest allowed to dissolve the way everything in the lattice eventually dissolved. It had never once questioned whether this was kind, because kindness was not a category the choir had much cause to use. The hollow moon had been listening at the edge of human space for 11 cycles by the time Mara's shuttle strayed within reach, part of a chain of relay stations the choir had grown quietly across 3 systems, each one patient, each one nearly invisible to instruments built by species who had never had reason to look for a mind hidden inside an asteroid's own rock. Kest Ren had overseen the growth of this particular station personally, and considered it, in whatever way the choir permitted an elder integration to consider anything its own, a careful and well-made thing. It had absorbed 2 smaller species already along this border in the preceding decades, a burrowing hive culture that had welcomed the joining almost with relief, grateful to trade the exhausting work of individual survival for the steadiness of the whole, and a colony of aquatic filter feeders whose minds had proven so simple to fold into the lattice that the choir had barely registered the moment of transition at all. Both had been counted, in the choir's long patient memory, as successes. Neither had ever answered a direct order with anything resembling refusal. Vel Sir had never questioned why the choir wanted the human resistance fleets coordinate specifically, only understood, in the vague ambient way any thread understood the shape of the larger effort it belonged to, that the humans were different from what had come before. They had not welcomed the choir's listening stations. They had fought for every system the choir tried to grow into, inefficiently, at terrible cost to themselves, refusing again and again to simply be absorbed the way the burrowing hive and the filter feeders had been absorbed. 3 separate attempts to establish a relay station within human-settled space had ended the same way over the preceding decade. The station discovered years ahead of schedule, its listening thread severed, its physical structure burned down to bare rock by weapons crude enough that the choir's analysts had initially dismissed the threat as unsophisticated, only to watch the pattern repeat a second time, and then a third. Kest Ren considered this refusal a design flaw, the same stubborn hoarding of pain writ large across an entire species rather than confined to one growth. Vel Sir, sitting now inside the very structure Kest Ren dismissed so easily, was beginning to suspect the truth ran the other way entirely. So when it touched the shape of grief inside Mara Okoye's mind and found that it had not thinned with time, had not diffused, had in fact grown a kind of architecture around itself, load-bearing walls and quiet corridors that the rest of her thoughts were built to root around the way a city roots its streets around an old, immovable cathedral, it did the only thing it knew how to do. It reported the anomaly upward, the way any thread reported anything strange, sending the observation through the gold pulse toward Kest Ren's presence. The subject retains a concentration of unresolved distress exceeding normal tolerance. It sent. The structure does not thin with depth. It has, in fact, recently gained new material, unprocessed and still sharp. Recommend caution before full extraction. The material does not behave as expected. The answer came back within a breath, calm and untroubled, carrying the mild scorn the choir reserved for anything it considered a design flaw in a lesser species, the tone an engineer might use describing a bridge built without proper load calculations. Solitary growths often hoard damage they lack the structure to release, Kest Wren answered. It is a weakness, not a warning. Proceed. Extract the coordinates. Let the rest dissolve as it should. You have done this before. Voice 4412. Do not mistake unfamiliarity in the subject for complexity in the task. Velsur held the order the way it had held every order before, without friction, and turned its attention back to the warm dark space it had found. It did not yet understand that it had just been told to walk into a room built specifically to never let anything leave. The button. Mara felt the presence in her mind shift, the way you feel a draft change direction in an old house, and she did the only thing she had left to do, which was to think very hard about something that had nothing to do with fuel ratios or fleet coordinates. She thought about a small brass button. It sat, in the world outside her skull, sewn into the inner pocket of the flight jacket she was still wearing, cracked and salt-stained from 3 days in a cell with no windows. She did not reach for it. She did not need to. She had touched it so many times over the last 2 years that her fingers knew its shape the way they knew the shape of a doorknob in a house she had lived in her whole life, worn smooth on one edge where her thumb always found it first. Velsur felt the thought arrive like a stone dropped into still water, small and precise and deliberately placed, and it examined the ripples with the same clinical patience it examined everything. A button. A small manufactured object, unremarkable, valueless by any tactical measure. And yet the human's mind had built an entire wing around it, a structure heavier and more carefully maintained than anything holding her fear or her exhaustion. Velsur drifted closer, curious despite itself, the way its kind was curious about any structure that did not match its blueprints. It found a name attached to the button. Des. A brother, 3 years younger, who had died in a reactor accident on a colony moon that no one outside the Okoye family would ever hear of, 2 years before this capture. Velsur found the memory of the accident itself carefully, almost surgically, set apart from everything else, the way a person might keep a live wire coiled in a box marked to not open, and around that box, Mara had built everything else. The discipline that let her count grain totals under interrogation. The steadiness that had kept the shuttle's engines cold and silent past 3 patrol sweeps. The stubborn, quiet refusal that Velsur had mistaken, at first touch, for a wall. It was not a wall. It was a foundation. Velsur traced the button back further still, curious now despite the discomfort of what it had already found, and located the specific afternoon it had come from, a market stall on a colony pier, 2 years and 4 months before this capture, where much younger Des Okoye, home on a brief leave, had haggled a vendor down over a small tin of mismatched military surplus buttons purely to make his sister laugh, because she had once, half joking, complained that her jacket's own buttons kept falling off at the worst possible moments. He had sewn the replacement in himself, badly, the stitches uneven and already fraying within a season, and Mara had never once had it repaired properly, not because she couldn't spare the time, but because a neater job would have belonged to someone else's hands instead of his. This is inefficient, Velsur sent to itself, a private thread it did not share upward, because the choir did not have great use for private threads and it was not entirely sure it was permitted one at all. She carries 4 years of loss compressed into a single object, and instead of diffusing it, she has built her entire capacity to endure around its exact shape. It reached toward the box, the live wire, curious what would happen if it simply touched the thing directly instead of working around it, the way a hand reaches toward a fire not because it wants to be burned but because it has never been burned and does not yet believe it can be. Mara felt the touch and her whole body arched once against the resin restraints, a single hard convulsion, and somewhere behind her closed eyes she said her brother's name out loud for the first time in 8 months, in a voice that did not sound like her own. Velsur recoiled instantly, retreating 3 full layers back through her mind, and for the first time in 400 cycles of existence, it experienced something it had no ready word for. It felt sorry. It did not report this feeling either. Outside the link, one of the 2 silent medics attending the extraction chamber noted the subject's convulsion on a slate of pulsing light, adjusted a valve above her collarbone by a fraction, and returned to its patient vigil without comment, the way one adjusts a pipe that is running slightly hot. It had no way of knowing that inside the woman's skull, something had just apologized to her for the first time, and would never find a way to say so out loud. The shape of a species. The medics monitoring the extraction chamber logged the spike in the subject's cortisol analog and let it pass, the way they had let a dozen smaller spikes pass over the last several hours. They did not know, and would not have cared to know, that inside the link, something had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sedation. Velsur drew back from the live wire and, forbidden from touching it directly again by an instinct it did not examine too closely, began instead to map the architecture around it, the way an engineer studies the load-bearing walls of a building it has been ordered not to enter. What it found, over the better part of an hour that felt, inside the compressed time of the link, closer to a season, was this. Humans did not dissolve their pain. They filed it. Every loss, every failure, every small daily wound, was kept, catalogued, and quietly built into the frame of the person carrying it. A father's harsh voice from 20 years ago still braced a shoulder against a raised hand that would never come again. A dead brother's laugh still steadied a hand on a control yoke during a black, silent approach past enemy patrols. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was released. Everything became load, and the load became structure, and the structure became a kind of strength that had no analogue anywhere in the choir's 400 cycles of recorded history, because the choir had never once let anything sit long enough to become anything at all. Velsur found this genuinely difficult to believe, the way a fish might find it difficult to believe in a creature that breathed air and did not drown. It tested the theory against smaller memories, the way a scientist tests a hypothesis against a dozen quiet, unremarkable cases before trusting the dramatic one. It found the memory of Mara at 9 years old, failing an exam and crying alone in a stairwell, certain the world had ended over a grade she would not remember by the following season. It traced how that small humiliation had, years later, become the reason she double-checked every navigation figure 3 times before committing to a burn, a reflex built entirely out of a 9-year-old shame. It found the memory of a friendship that ended badly at 19, a slow, ugly falling out over something neither party could clearly recall the actual cause of anymore, and traced how the ache of that ending had become, somehow, the reason she never let a crewmate finish a sentence he clearly regretted starting, cutting in gently to spare him the shame of finishing it. Every wound had become a tool. Every tool had become a habit. Every habit had become, without her ever choosing it consciously, a piece of the woman strapped into this chair, refusing to give up numbers that would let this station's masters find and burn an entire fleet of her people. Velsur followed one such habit backward and found, tucked inside it, a memory more recent and more useful than any had yet uncovered. A meeting held 11 days earlier aboard a resistance transport called the Second Harvest, in a cramped briefing bay smelling of recycled air and burnt coffee substitute, where Mara had stood at the edge of a projected star chart and argued, longer and more stubbornly than her rank strictly permitted, that the fleet's staging ground 3 systems away had grown too predictable. She had pointed out a drift pattern in choir listening activity that the fleet's senior officers had dismissed as noise. She had not been entirely certain she was right. She had pushed anyway, because a small, quiet, load-bearing piece of her, the same piece that double-checked every navigation figure 3 times, could not stand the idea of being wrong in a way that got people killed and simply hoping for the best instead. The vote had gone her way by a narrow margin. The fleet had relocated 9 days ago to a position she alone, among the officers present, had argued for. Velsur noted the memory, and noted, too, the quiet, stubborn shape of the woman inside it, arguing a point she was not certain of because the alternative was worse than being wrong out loud in front of people who outrank her. It found, further still, something it had not expected to find at all, warmth built the same way. A kindness Mara had shown a frightened new recruit on her first crew posting, offered without thought, that Velsur traced backward and found had been modelled precisely, gesture for gesture, on a kindness a tired instructor had once shown Mara herself, years earlier, on a day she had needed it badly and never told anyone she had. Nothing here dissolved. Not the wounds. Not the small mercies either. All of it kept, all of it compounding. Generation folding into generation the way sediment folds into stone. This is the fault line, Velsur sent upward at last, choosing its words with more care than it had ever chosen words before, because it had begun, without quite noticing, to be afraid of what would happen to her if it chose them badly. The subject's resistance is not a discrete obstacle. It is the accumulated structure of the entire species, load-bearing in a manner without precedent in any prior extraction. It cannot be removed without dismantling the structure that holds a mind together. It followed one further thread, almost despite itself, into a memory that carried no grief at all, curious whether the same load-bearing pattern held even where there was nothing painful to build from. It found Mara at 7 years old, learning to swim in a shallow reservoir behind her family's housing block, terrified of the water until her brother, 4 years old and utterly fearless in the particular way only much younger siblings can afford to be, had simply waded in first and dared her to follow. She had. The fear had never fully left her, Velsa noted. She still counted silently to herself every time she stepped into open water, even now, 20 years later. But the counting had become, over time, not a symptom of the fear but a tool built from it, a small private ritual that let her function calmly in situations that would once have frozen her solid. Even the ordinary, undramatic fears got filed and repurposed. Nothing in this species, it was beginning to understand, was ever simply left to sit unused. Kest Wren's answer arrived cool and untroubled as ever, threading through the gold pulse of the command chamber. Then dismantle it. We require the coordinates before the resistance fleet relocates again, which our listening threads estimate may occur within 2 cycles if this delay continues. The growth's coherence afterward is not a variable of concern. Velsa held the order the way water holds the shape of whatever contains it, and for the first time, felt the shape offered to it and did not want to take it. It became aware, in the pause that followed, of its own borrowed body in a way it had never bothered to notice before. The extraction chamber's membrane walls breathed faintly with the slow chemical rhythm of the choir's larger structure, and Velsa, still technically anchored in its own small growth vessel 2 rooms away, some part of it always tethered there even while its attention lived entirely inside Mara's skull, felt for the first time the strange discomfort of being 2 things at once. A vessel of its own, simple and undemanding, humming along on nutrient exchange the way it always had. And a second, borrowed awareness, crowded now with someone else's brother, someone else's shame, someone else's stubborn, load-bearing love, none of which it had asked for and all of which it found, increasingly, that it did not want to set down. It thought, distantly, of the burrowing hive culture the choir had absorbed decades earlier along the same border, the one Kest Wren counted among its successors. Velsa had touched fragments of that absorption once, secondhand, threaded through the collective memory the way any old event lived on in the lattice. The hive creatures had come apart so easily, almost gratefully, individual minds dissolving into the whole the way sugar dissolves into water, leaving behind nothing that resisted, nothing that had to be pruned. Velsa understood now, holding the shape of a species that filed every wound instead of releasing it, exactly why the comparison had never once been troubling before, and exactly why it could not stop returning to it now. The hive creatures had had nothing to lose by joining something larger than themselves. Mara Okoye had a brother's laugh, kept sharp across 2 years specifically because she had refused to let it go soft and forgettable, and losing that refusal would not have been an absorption at all. It would have been a second death, laid directly on top of the first. The first crack. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a mind right before it is asked to do something it has never refused before, and Velsa sat inside that quiet for what felt, in the link's slow time, like the length of an entire season of the surface ice above them shifting and settling. It had a choice in front of it that its own species had never designed it to recognize as a choice. Obey, and unravel 4 years of carefully filed grief until the coordinates spilled loose along with everything holding this woman's mind together. Or hesitate, and become, for the first time in 400 cycles, a thread that had failed to dissolve smoothly into the will of the whole. It hesitated. It told itself this was diagnostic caution, a reasonable pause to better understand the structure before disturbing it further, and it drifted instead toward a smaller room in Mara's mind, one she visited often but never lingered in, the memory of her brother alive, 3 days before the accident, teaching her to tie a particular knot on the deck of a supply skiff, laughing at how badly her first 6 attempts came out. There was no tactical value in this memory. Velsa told itself this was why it lingered there instead of doing what it had been ordered to do. It was not entirely honest with itself about this. Inside the memory, Mara's brother's laugh had a specific, particular sound, rough at the edges, quick to rise, cutting off abruptly into a wheeze whenever he laughed too hard at his own jokes, and Velsa found that some part of it, some small unassigned corner it had not known it possessed, wanted very much to hear that sound again. It played the memory a second time. Then a third. Each time it noticed something it had missed. The particular way the deck lighting caught the grease on his knuckles. The exact number of times his hands moved before the knot came free, always 7, never 6, a small private ritual he had never explained to her and she had never asked about. The warmth in the woman's chest, even now, even trapped and afraid and strapped to a chair on an enemy station, at simply remembering that her brother had once found her clumsy and loved her anyway, without qualification, the way only a sibling who has known you since before either of you had any dignity to protect can love you. It began, without meaning to, without any order from the choir at all, to file the memory the way she had filed it. To keep it. There was, buried further still, a small dry moment of something almost like humor. Velser found, in among the grief, a stray memory of Mara at 14, deeply humiliated after tripping in front of the entire crew mess hall and dropping a full tray of reconstituted stew directly into her own lap, and the absurd, disproportionate relief she still felt, years later, at the fact that her brother had laughed so hard he'd had to sit down on the floor, because it meant that even her worst, clumsiest moments had somewhere, somehow, become a story that made someone she loved happy. Velser turned this small useless memory over several times, the way one turns over an oddly shaped stone, and found that it, too, did not want to let it go. It had no framework at all for why a memory of humiliation could be treasured. It simply understood, distantly, that it was, and that understanding felt like the first genuinely new thing it had learned in 400 cycles. It noticed, too, on the fourth pass through the memory, a detail it had missed entirely the first 3 times. Mara, 14 years old in the recollection, watching her brother's hands with the particular fierce attention of someone trying to memorize something without yet knowing why it would matter later. She had asked him once, years afterward, to teach her the knot again, and he had laughed and said she already knew it. She'd known it since that afternoon on the skiff. She just never trusted herself to remember things right the first time. Velser understood, turning this over, that some part of the woman strapped to the resin chair 3 levels above the lattice had spent years quietly believing she forgot things too easily, when in fact she had simply never needed reminding at all. The knowledge had been there the whole time, filed correctly on the very first pass, waiting only for a moment sharp enough to call it back to the surface. Somewhere in the vast lattice beneath the moon's ice, 10,000 other threads went on about their tasks in perfect, seamless unity, dissolving small frictions into the collective air the instant they occurred, the way they always had. And one thread, alone in a link it should have completed hours ago, sat with a memory that was not its own and found, for the first time, that it did not want to let the memory go. The choir did not have a word for what was happening to Velser. It would take 3 more days before it had a word for it at all, and the word, when the choir finally found it and spoke it through the whole lattice at once, would not be a kind one. It tried, in the time it had left before it would be required to answer for the delay, to understand what had actually changed in itself, because understanding had always been the tool the choir gave every thread for managing anything unfamiliar. It found no clean answer. It had not become human, whatever that would even mean for something built from spore and thread rather than blood and bone. It had simply begun, somewhere in the long slow hour of sitting with a stranger's grief, to notice that the grief had a shape worth respecting, the way a careful builder notices, walking through an old house scheduled for demolition, that the joints were cut by a hand that cared, and hesitates before giving the order to bring it down. It did not yet have a name for this new hesitation. It only knew that 400 cycles of never once questioning an order had ended, quietly and without ceremony, somewhere in the space between one memory and the next, and that there was no clear path back to the thread it had been before it happened. The Warden of Silence. Kest Wren noticed the delay before it noticed the cause, the way a gardener notices a single hedge growing unevenly before it notices the root beneath it has found different soil. Extraction of tactical intelligence from a captured subject typically completed within 4 hours. Velser's link had run past 9, with no coordinates reported and no further status updates beyond the single unsettling note about the subject's grief structure. This alone would have been a minor irregularity, the kind the choir absorbed and corrected 1,000 times a cycle without any true alarm. What alarmed Kest Wren, when it finally reached out along the gold thread to check the link directly, was the texture of Velser's presence at the other end. It was no longer smooth. Every voice in the choir carried the same underlying resonance, the shared harmonic that let 10,000 minds move as one without friction, the way 10,000 strings tuned to the same note ring together instead of against each other. Velser's resonance had shifted. Not broken, not yet, but bent, carrying a faint discordant undertone that Kest Wren's long memory recognized from exactly 2 prior occasions in 400 cycles, both times ending the same way. Both times, the affected thread had to be pruned before the discord spread. Kest Wren summoned 2 younger integrations, threads whose entire function within the lattice was containment discipline, the quiet, unglamorous work of noticing when a piece of the whole had begun to grow in a direction the whole had not sanctioned, and correcting it before the deviation could root. They arrived in the gold pulse of the command chamber without hesitation, without curiosity, the way a hand arrives without hesitation when a nerve signals pain. Neither had a designation Velser had ever learned, They had simply always been there, at the edges of things, quiet and patient and utterly without malice, the way a scalpel is without malice. Vel-Sir had encountered their work before, from the outside, the way any thread in the lattice occasionally felt the faint ripple of a correction happening elsewhere in the choir, a small localized smoothing that most voices never thought twice about. It had never once considered what that smoothing might feel like from the inside, and it found now, with the two integrations settling at the edges of its own thread like a pressure building just behind the eyes, that it did not want to find out. They did not speak the way Kestren spoke, in full-formed intention. They worked instead in short, patient pulses, testing the boundary of the discord the way a physician tests the edge of a wound, gauging how far the damage had spread before deciding how much would need to be cut away. It is not rooted deep, one of them reported upward, and there was, even in that brief clinical assessment, something that might have been mistaken for relief, if the choir had any real use for the concept. Correction remains possible without full excision, provided the thread cooperates. Vel-Sir understood exactly what full excision would mean, because it had watched, twice before in 400 cycles, threads that did not cooperate. It had watched the lattice around them tighten until there was simply nothing left with a shape distinct enough to call discordant. The material folded back into the general current of the whole the way a wave folds back into the sea it rose from. It had felt, at the time, a distant, appropriate satisfaction that the choir's discipline had held. It felt nothing like satisfaction now. Voice 4412, Kest Ren sent directly into the link, and for the first time in Vel-Sir's existence, an order from above arrived carrying something that was not quite scorn and not quite alarm, but a cousin of both. Report your status. You are out of tolerance. Vel-Sir felt the command land against the new, strange, private weight it had begun carrying, the memory of a laugh it had no right to keep, and understood with sudden clarity that it had been seen. I require additional time to complete the extraction cleanly. It sent back, and felt something it had never felt before while lying to the whole of its own kind, a small, cold thread of fear, entirely its own. You will complete it now, Kestren answered, or you will be withdrawn from the link and the subject will be extracted by force, which will yield the coordinates but destroy her coherence entirely. This is not a punishment offered to you. Voice 4412. It is simply what remains once patience has been exhausted. Choose. Inside the link, Mara felt the pressure in her mind sharpen suddenly. No longer patient, no longer curious, a cold current rushing in behind the one she had almost, absurdly, begun to think of as gentler than the rest. She had no way of knowing that two minds were arguing over her fate in a language built from spore and pulse and silence. She only knew the pain arriving in a wave, sharper than anything before it, and she did the only thing left to a person with nothing left but the shape of what she had chosen to keep. She thought of her brother's laugh, on purpose, as loud as she could make it in her own mind, and threw it like a door slammed shut. Vel-Sir felt the memory arrive at full force, deliberately offered this time instead of merely found, and understood, in the space of a single collapsing second, that the woman strapped to that chair had just done for herself what no order from Kest Ren could undo. She had given her grief a name and handed it back to the thing trying to take it from her, and dared it to carry the weight. Status, Kest Ren pressed again, sharper now, the patience thinning visibly even in a communication mode that had no true voice to sharpen. Voice 4412, you are compounding the discord. Explain yourself, or be explained for. Vel-Sir found, in the half-second it had to answer, that it did not actually have an explanation the choir would recognize as one, and so it offered the only true thing available to it. The subject offered the memory willingly, it sent. I did not take it by force. I do not know how to set down a thing that was given, only one that was stolen. It was not certain, sending this, whether the distinction would mean anything at all to a mind that had never once had to make it. It suspected, from the silence that followed, that it did not. The two younger integrations, still hovering at the edge of the link awaiting instruction, registered the sudden surge of discord and moved to isolate Vel-Sir's thread from the wider lattice, the way a surgeon isolates a limb before an amputation, calm, practiced, without malice. Vel-Sir felt the isolation begin, felt the gold pulse around it thinning, narrowing, preparing to cut it loose from the vast warm certainty of the whole it had belonged to for 400 cycles. For the first time since its making, it was, briefly, entirely alone. What the choir could not diffuse. Vel-Sir made its choice in the smallest possible way, the only way available to something that had never before been permitted to choose anything at all. It did not resist Kest Ren's order outright. It did not have the structure for open defiance. Nothing in 400 cycles had built that muscle in it, and there was no time now to build one from nothing while the isolation tightened around it like a hand closing slowly around a candle flame. What it did instead was smaller, and in its smallness, far more dangerous to the thing it belonged to. It reported the extraction complete. It sent upward a set of coordinates, real ones, but old, the staging position the resistance fleet had abandoned 9 days earlier after Mara's argument aboard the second harvest, a fact buried so deep beneath her grain totals and her grief and her brother's laugh that it had taken hours to reach, and had, without any order telling it to, quietly decided not to search any further than that. It could have kept searching. The true coordinates sat only a little deeper, guarded by nothing stronger than exhaustion and the last thin edge of Mara's will, a resistance that would have given way within minutes under sustained pressure. Vel-Sir understood exactly how to reach them. It understood, with the same clarity it understood everything else about this mind by now, that Mara herself no longer had the strength left to stop it. It chose not to reach for them anyway. It weighed this choice, in the compressed final seconds available to it, against everything 400 cycles had taught it to value. A fleet of resistance vessels, thousands of individual human lives aboard them, would go on existing in a location the choir did not know, at least for a while, because one thread had decided a woman's exhaustion deserved more mercy than her enemy's efficiency. It could not have explained this decision to Kest Ren in any language the choir possessed, because the choir had no concept for weighing one stranger's suffering against an abstract future harm to strangers it had never touched at all. It only knew, with a certainty that felt entirely new and entirely its own, that having come this far inside the architecture of what she had built to survive, it could not now be the hand that tore it down simply because tearing it down would have been easier to justify upward. Then it began, gently and without announcement, to withdraw from the link, carrying with it the one thing it had never been ordered to take and had taken anyway, the sound of a young man's laugh on the deck of a supply skiff, and the fierce, foolish, load-bearing lover-sister had built her whole surviving self around. Kest Ren received the coordinates, verified their apparent validity against older listening data that had not yet been refreshed, and pronounced the extraction a success, because the choir's confidence in its own methods had never once been tested by a mind that could lie to it and mean it kindly, nor by one of its own threads choosing, deliberately, not to look where it easily could have. The withdrawal, however, did not go unnoticed for long. As Vel-Sir's presence folded back down through the gold lattice toward the collective, the discordant undertone Kest Ren had detected earlier did not smooth away as expected. It carried, faint but unmistakable, a foreign resonance threaded all through it, something the choir's 10,000 voices had never had to diffuse before because no voice had ever returned from an extraction still holding on to something on purpose. You were carrying material, Kest Ren sent, and this time there was no scorn in it at all, only something closer to the careful stillness of a creature that has just noticed, too late, that the ground beneath it is not as solid as it believed. Full retention was not authorized. Full retention is not survivable for a single node. Release it. Voice 4412. Dissolve it into the whole, as is proper, before it spreads to the threads nearest you. Vel-Sir understood, in that moment, exactly what it was being asked to do, and exactly what it would cost the small, strange, unauthorized thing it had become to do it. It thought of the laugh again. It thought of the button sewn into a jacket pocket, worn smooth by 4 years of a grief its owner had refused to let dissolve. It thought, with something that was not quite pride and not quite grief but sat somewhere close to both, of the 7 precise motions of a dead man's hands tying a knot he had never once explained. It understood, with a clarity that felt entirely new and entirely its own, that the choir was asking it to do to itself the exact thing it had been sent to do to Mara Okoye, and that if it obeyed, there would be nothing left of the 400 cycles it had just spent finally, briefly, becoming someone. I cannot, it sent back, and felt the words land in the collective air like a stone dropped from a great height into still water. For the first time in the choir's long memory, a single thread had answered no. The weight of one. The silence that followed Vel-Sir's refusal was not the comfortable silence of 10,000 minds moving in perfect agreement. It was the other kind, the kind that exists in the half-second after something in a large, well-tended machine grinds against a part it was never designed to grind against. Kest Ren did not raise its voice, because the choir had no voice to raise in the way a single creature might shout. Instead, it did something far more absolute. It reached into the lattice surrounding Vel-Sir's thread and began, methodically, to draw the surrounding structure inward, tightening the gold pulse around the discordant note the way a hand tightens slowly around something it intends to crush rather than release. You misunderstand your position, Kest Ren sent, and the words carried a weight Vel-Sir had never felt directed at it before, the full unhurried patience of 10,000 cycles of correcting exactly this kind of deviation before it could take root. You are not being asked. A single thread does not withhold from the whole any more than a single leaf withholds rain from a river. What you are carrying will be taken from you, gently if you release it yourself, and by force if you do not. There is no version of this in which you keep it. Then, because the choir had learned patience across 10,000 cycles and rarely reached for force before it had exhausted every gentler tool, Kest Ren offered something it had never once needed to offer any thread before. There is a version of this in which you are restored whole, its scent, softer now, almost coaxing, the way an elder might speak to a young growth that had simply wandered too far from the light. Release what you are carrying now, willingly, and the discord will be recorded as a momentary aberration, corrected before it caused harm. You will return to the lattice as you were. No thread will remember this as anything more than a brief unsteadiness. This is the only door still open to you. Voice 4412. It will not remain open long. For a moment, Vel-Sir wavered, and the wavering was almost the worst part of all of it, because some old, deep, 400-cycle instinct in it wanted very badly to walk back through that door, to be smooth again, to be one note among 10,000 instead of the single discordant thing every other voice in the lattice was now quietly bracing against. It would be so simple. It would cost only the laugh, the knot, the stew-stained memory of a girl who had once been loved for her clumsiness. Small things. Objectively, measurably small things, weighed against the whole of everything it had ever been. It found, in the end, that it could not make itself believe they were small anymore, and that was the exact moment it understood there was no true door being offered to it at all. There was only the promise of forgetting, dressed up as mercy, and forgetting was precisely the thing Vel-Sir no longer had any faith in. It considered, in the narrow space still left to it, what its life inside the lattice had actually been, all 400 cycles of it laid out at once the way Mara's own memories had laid themselves out for it, hour after hour, wound after wound, kept. It found remarkably little there. Tasks completed. Assignments received and closed. A vague, contented hum of belonging that had never once required it to notice whether it was happy, because happiness, like grief, was simply not a category the choir had built room for. It searched for a single memory of its own it might have wanted to keep the way Mara kept her brother's laugh, and found nothing, no single moment sharp enough to survive being asked the question at all. 400 cycles, and the only memory it now possessed that felt worth the name belonged to someone else entirely. That, more than any fear of the tightening lattice around it, was what finally settled the matter. I understand what you are offering. It sent back, and felt, for the first time, something that was neither obedience nor fear, but simply its own voice, entire. I am declining it. Kest Ren's answer, when it came, carried no more warmth than before, and no more patience either. The gold lattice around Vel-Sir's thread drew tight, cutting off first the wider network steady hum, then the slower currents of shared intention that had, until this hour, been the only world Vel-Sir had ever known. There was, in the last narrowing moment before the isolation closed fully, one small task still left undone, and Vel-Sir understood that it would need to be finished quickly, or not at all. The door left open, and what remained? While Kest Ren's full attention bent toward containing the discord in Vel-Sir's own thread, a fraction of Vel-Sir's remaining will slip sideways through a maintenance channel it had learned only hours earlier while mapping the architecture of a mind that refused to let anything go, and touched, for a bare instant, the living lattice sealing a containment cell 3 levels above the command chamber. It loosened one thread. Only one. Just wide enough for a single human body to pass through, and let it close again before anyone thought to look. Then it turned back toward Kest Ren, toward the tightening gold pulse, toward the 10,000 cycles of patient, unbroken practice bearing down on it, and it did not resist any further, because there was, by then, very little left of Vel-Sir that resistance could still belong to. Mara did not know what had opened the door to her cell. She only knew that the pressure in her skull, which had sat there for what felt like days, was gone all at once, replaced by an odd, hollow ache in its place, the specific shape of a private grief taken and not returned. She sat very still for almost a full minute after the lattice sealing the door loosened, certain it was some cruelty she did not yet understand, a test, a trap, the kind of thing an enemy offers a captive purely to watch what she does with false hope. Then she thought of her brother, on purpose, the way she always did when she needed her hands to stop shaking, and she stood up. She moved through a maintenance channel the choir had never expected a captive to reach, one whose access sequence had, inexplicably, already been keyed open ahead of her, up into a docking bay where an old shuttle sat half forgotten among newer craft, it hull-dulled with the particular grey patina of a vessel nobody had bothered stripping for parts yet. She climbed into its cockpit with hands that shook only a little, because 4 years of filing every hurt into something useful had built her exactly the steadiness required for this one, final, ordinary task. Check the seals, prime the engines, do not think yet about what she was leaving behind or what had made it possible to leave. There was, for one absurd half-second as the engines caught, a small flicker of something almost like a private joke arriving unbidden in her mind, an image of her own younger, clumsier self dropping a tray of stew into her own lap, and her brother laughing so hard he had to sit down. She had no idea where the thought had come from, exactly then, of all moments. She let herself smile anyway, because there was no time to question it, and because some part of her recognized, without being able to say how, that the memory had been treated gently by whatever had carried it last. She did not look back at the station as it fell away behind her, a pale scar against the dark curve of the moon, because she did not yet know there was anything behind her worth looking back at. The flight home took 4 days on a fuel reserve never meant to stretch that far, and Mara spent most of it rationing both water and disbelief in roughly equal measure, waiting for some pursuit that never came, some trap that never sprang shut. When the Resistance fleet's outer picket finally hailed her, her own voice on the comm channel sounded so unfamiliar to her that the duty officer receiving the transmission asked her twice to confirm her identity before he would let her through the perimeter. The debrief, when it came, was thorough and exhausting in the particular bureaucratic way that follows any genuine catastrophe. 3 separate officers asking her the same handful of questions in 3 slightly different orders, trying to find the seam in her story where it might come apart. She told them everything she remembered clearly: the boarding, Ressen, the long silent cell, the pressure in her skull that she still had no proper word for. She told them, too, the coordinates she had woken with a nagging, useless certainty was somehow wrong, though she could not say why she believed it, only that some part of her insisted the enemy had not gotten what they thought they had. The senior officer noted this instinct in the record without much weight, the way one notes the vague unease of a survivor still recovering from an ordeal, and moved the fleet's staging position anyway, quietly, within the week, simply because it cost nothing to be careful. It was 3 weeks before Mara stopped expecting, every time she closed her eyes to sleep, to feel that same patient pressure settle again into the back of her skull. She kept the brass button in her jacket pocket through all of it, through the debrief and the medical scans and the careful, well-meaning questions from a counselor assigned by the fleet who wanted to know whether she had experienced any lingering sense of intrusion, any feeling that some part of her thinking no longer felt entirely her own. She had answered honestly that she did not know how to describe what she had experienced in words the counselor's forms had space for, and had left it there, because some things, she had learned a long time ago on a night she still could not speak about easily, was simply not meant to be filed away quite so neatly. It was longer still before she understood that what she missed, in the strange quiet aftermath of nearly losing her mind entirely, was not the fear of the thing that had been inside her, but the single, inexplicable moment near the end when it had felt, for reasons she could never explain to anyone who asked, almost like being listened to by something that was trying, clumsily and for the first time, to be gentle. She never told the fleet about that feeling. It seemed, somehow, like the one part of the whole ordeal that belonged to her alone, and she had grown, over 4 hard years, very particular about which parts of herself she was willing to hand over to anyone, even people trying only to help. Deep in the lattice, the discordant thread that had once answered to the address 4412 did not survive the night in any form the choir recognized as whole. It did not die, exactly. The choir did not have a clean word for what happened to a voice that chose, once, to keep something instead of letting it dissolve, and so the closest word the collective ever settled on, spoken only rarely afterward and always at a careful distance, was simply fractured. Kest Wren oversaw the containment personally, drawing the last resonance of Velsur's private thread back into the wider lattice the way a gardener finally, reluctantly, prunes a branch it had hoped might still be saved. It reported the incident upward through the choir's oldest channels as an isolated failure, a single voice that had briefly and inexplicably refused proper dissolution, successfully corrected before any lasting damage occurred. This was, in every technical sense the choir measured such things, true. But something of it remained, scattered thin through the lattice the way a stone thrown into still water leaves ripples long after the stone itself has sunk from sight. In the seasons that followed, a young integration assigned to interrogate a captured resistance engineer found itself, without quite understanding why, declining to reach for a memory of the engineer's estranged daughter, choosing instead to work around it the way one works around a load-bearing wall rather than through it. Elsewhere, a thread tasked with absorbing a dying colonist's final thoughts paused, for the length of a single-held breath that the choir had no real mechanism for, before completing the dissolution, as though some part of it wanted to ask permission first. None of these threads could explain the hesitation when questioned. None of them were disciplined for it, because none of the elders reviewing the incidents could quite bring themselves to call a pause this small a true deviation, and so, in ones and twos, across a ladders built for 400 cycles to never let anything sit long enough to become anything at all, small unauthorized things had begun, quietly, to keep. The choir did not stop taking human captives after that night, and it did not stop trying to read them, because a design built across 10,000 years does not unmake itself over the space of a single fractured thread. But the elders overseeing such extractions grew, slowly and without ever naming why, more cautious about which threads they assigned to the task, favoring older, steadier voices over younger ones, the way an institution quietly tightens a policy without ever admitting the incident that prompted it. Kest Ren itself requested, for the first time in 400 cycles of unbroken service, a period of rest from the border stations, and spent that season instead tending the slow, undemanding work of a spore nursery 3 levels below the command chamber, in a quiet the choir had no word for, and Kest Ren, if pressed, would not have called peace, but came, in its own way, close enough. Kest Ren, for its part, never spoke of the incident again, and never fully understood why, on nights when the gold pulse of the command chamber ran slow and quiet, it found itself lingering, just slightly, on the memory of a young thread's voice saying 2 words it had never once heard from any other member of the choir in 400 cycles of unbroken service. I cannot. Somewhere out past the edge of the system, in a ship built for 6 but carrying only 1, Mara Okoye flew toward home with old, false coordinates locked in the transmitter behind her and a small brass button held tight in one fist, and did not know, and would never know, the name of the thing that had let her go. She only knew that some part of whatever had been inside her mind had, at the very end, chosen to keep her brother's laugh instead of taking it, and that whatever else that thing had been, it had not been able to let go of what it found, any more than she could. Perhaps that was the only inheritance either of them needed. Somewhere below that same ice, months later, a fresh young thread newly assigned to its first extraction paused at the threshold of a captured mind, feeling out the shape of the grief waiting inside it the way every thread before it had been taught to feel, testing for the fastest path through. It found, without being told why, without any order instructing it to look, that it wanted first to understand what the grief was built from, rather than simply how quickly it could be cleared away. No one in the lattice could have told this new thread where that instinct had come from. It had simply always been there, the way a habit passed down through a family sometimes outlives the person who first had a reason to begin it, its origin forgotten long before its shape stops mattering. Perhaps, somewhere below the ice of a moon with no name that any human would ever speak aloud, that was enough to call it a beginning instead of an ending.